down or a tax that they would internally collect than you are about trying to negotiate in quantities. Where do we stand now? We've sort of given up, I think, on for the time being anyway, on a top-down approach. And there's lots of talk about a bottom-up approach. And there's lots of disagreement about whether this bottom-up approach is enough, is nearly enough to deal with this problem. I think that the original spirit of Kyoto was a top-down spirit, that we were going to arrive at something that was a good solution. I think the spirit, this could be contested, I think the spirit of Kyoto was that the Annex I countries, the advanced countries, showed good faith by quote-unquote binding agreements, cutting 2012, or around 2012 emissions by around 5% relative to 1990 emissions. And then the idea, the spirit, I think, was that later on the developing countries, the Annex II countries, would join in, having seen this good faith act, and the Annex I countries would tighten up. And that didn't happen. The U.S. didn't ratify, others dropped out, and it pretty much, at the moment, looks like a kind of a dead end. My target is to, what I want to do is go back to a top-down solution and argue that negotiating a uniform minimum carbon price that's internationally harmonized. We all come to some sort of an agreement on what this price ought to be, but it's nationally retained, has better properties than trying to negotiate end quantity targets. Okay, so it's a futuristic kind of message. I mean, this is not the world we're facing now. It's as if we are ideal designers and we're trying to design a top-down solution. Now, let me go back to basics and talk about desirable properties for negotiation instruments. And excuse me, before I do that, I just want to point out that this issue about quantities versus prices has come up in the form of tradable quotas versus international taxes or prices. And there's arguments on both sides. I think that even without what I'm going to talk about now, I personally think that there was a stronger argument on the side of using taxes or prices than on the side of using quantities with or without tradability, or with tradability certainly. Prices are volatile when you set the quantities, and I think that that is really a bad feature. If the prices roared up for some reason, then Wall Street would be blamed. You could set back the whole cause of rational climate policy. So the price volatility is worse, is a very bad feature. I don't think that if you set a tax, the quantity variability, I don't think it would bother people as much. There's administrative issues. This, within the U.S. and within the EU, maybe tradable permits and taxes have comparable administrative costs, but I think that internationally it's much easier to administer a harmonized system of prices or taxes. And there's this international transfer issue that if you handed out permits in proportion to population or something like that, then everyone knows the U.S. is going to be paying over billions or hundreds of billions to China, and that just isn't going to work. It makes it too explicit and too upfront, whereas internally taxing doesn't look like so much of an international transfer. So here's three desirable properties, going back to basics. One would be to induce cost effectiveness. Well, we're economists, and I don't have to argue about that idea. The second is more behavioral or heuristic. it's good for it to be of one dimension centered on a natural focal point. That facilitates finding an agreement with relatively low transaction costs. So this has got elements of Schelling and his ideas about focal points, and elements of Coase and his ideas about transactions costs. These are two tremendously influential ideas, but so far as I can make out, it's very hard to make them rigorous in theory, in particular Schelling's argument that we're better off disagreeing about one focal point. It's like a very important observation, and tons has been written about it, but I haven't seen a good, rigorous game theoretic defense, convincing defense of it. The third thing, and here's what I'm really going to concentrate on, is that it's desirable that the instrument, prices, quantities, whatever it is, embody what I'll call countervailing force against narrow self-interest and against free riding, by automatically incentivizing all negotiating parties to internalize the externality. So I want the instrument to have something so that people are, so the actors are internalizing to some degree the externality. Well, on cost effectiveness, tradable permits, and if they can be made to work, and one price both achieve cost efficiency. The focal point argument goes to negotiating a single price. The externality internalization holds only for the price. And I'll just try to see what that argument is and then make it a little bit more rigorous. If we're agreeing on one price, no matter how, one uniform price, well, we're locked in the room representing all countries and we have to come out with one price, or maybe there's a voting mechanism that comes up with a single price, then what price do I want? I want a low price because that won't force me to cut back so much on carbon emissions and will save me some money. But I want a high price because that will force everyone else to cut back, right? So they seem to have a kind of a counterbalancing property. Whereas my way of thinking about quantities is that it hasn't got this counterbalancing effect with any quantity.